I'm Jamal, I'm a Counterfire member in London, and I'm speaking to activist and author Elaine Graham-Leigh. So I just sort of want to start by talking about the G7 summit that happened obviously a few weeks ago now. It seemed a sort of relatively widespread feeling coming out of that the actions proposed by the G7 were inadequate to deal with the situation we're in now. So I was wondering, what's your analysis sort of the ruling class response to the climate crisis in the light of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite interesting because on the one hand, while no one's proposed actions that really would be adequate to deal with the scale of the climate emergency, if you take all the proposals at face value, they're not necessarily completely appalling. So you can create a kind of a narrative where, people are, governments are going some ways towards dealing with the climate crisis, and look at these percentages for renewable energy, it's all going in the right direction. But the problem is that when you actually analyze what they're really doing as opposed to what they say they're going to do, we're nowhere near meeting any of the targets that were set. Targets from Copenhagen, targets from Paris, they're all going to be missed by miles. So it's really a kind of and there was a very telling statement, I thought, in a report that came out to end of last year that was analysing this, and it said, well, one thing that's good is that countries' submissions for what they say they're going to do are getting better and more polished. They're putting more time into their submissions, which is, it always makes me think of back when I was doing exams, and you spend ages and ages sort of making a really elaborate revision timetable. You don't actually do any revision, but the timetable is really good, and it kind of reminds me of that, rather, that they're getting better at the talk, but they're still not doing anything. So what's actually happening is entirely inadequate.
Yeah. So sort of within the climate movement, there's sort of several different analyses of where the climate crisis come from, what the cause is, and how to deal with it. Could you sort of outline those various sort of views and give your opinion on which is kind of most accurate?
Yeah, sure. Well, if I answered that properly, we'd be here all night.
Yeah.
So I think, the big division in my view, in sort of different parts of sort of climate campaigning, I think has always been whether we should be looking to individual action or whether we need to have some sort of collective action. So it's about whether it's about persuading people to change their own lifestyles or whether it's about sort of systemic changes. And I think that remains a big division. And I think it remains a big division. And I think so many people still believe that the way to deal with this is to get individuals to change what they personally do in their everyday life, because people see that, well, governments aren't getting it done, so what else is there? So in many ways, I think it's almost sort of a council of despair, and that's actually almost, people don't, who take that viewpoint don't tend to say this is a council of despair, but you almost always, when people are talking about that, they say, well, what can we do when governments won't do anything, when companies won't do anything? Well, what we can do is eat less meat ourselves, or decide to leave the car at home one day a week, or these kind of minor things which aren't harmful but aren't going to change the way that the system works, and aren't actually going to make any difference really to our emissions and to our response to the climate crisis. So we absolutely have to have a change on a systemic level. And the answer to, well, we can't trust governments and corporations to do it, which is correct, we can't, has got to be, well, we have to find a collective way of making that change, which of course is about building the movement and getting out on the streets and being a revolutionary. So that's sort of obviously where I fall on that divide.
Mm-hmm. So you sort of answered my next question, but given that, how do you think sort of the left should be responding to the climate crisis as it unfolds, and how should we be making the arguments?
Well, I think, obviously, in addition to what I just said, I think something that's really important is that the left needs not to be afraid of climate as an issue. There has been this kind of historic perception that if you're a socialist, then what you're interested in is smokestacks and 5-year plans and all that sort of stuff, and that in some ways being a socialist is antithetical to caring about the climate. And obviously that's not true. I think you have to be a red to be a green, and you have to be a green to be a red. I think there's we're all recognizing that these are problems of capitalism, and that we have to overthrow capitalism ultimately to solve them. And that's we're all on the same page here. There isn't a contradiction. But I think what we need to do is not see the climate crisis as something that's sort of extra. I think there can sometimes be a tendency on the left to say, oh yes, and of course climate, but not really see it as part of the other things that we're fighting. And I think that actually the climate crisis is very much part, for example, of the struggles that we're all involved in with the People's Assembly. And I think we need to be maybe a bit more explicit that that it needs to be front and center of those struggles, which happened very well actually in the demo on 26th of June. I mean, it was great to see so much Extinction Rebellion presence there. I think that's part of that sort of bringing together of the struggles, which I think is what we need to do.
Yeah. So do you think the events this year, obviously in recent weeks, we've seen sort of the heat wave in Canada and the US, and there was that quite insane picture of the fire in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Do you think those kind of things are going to increase consciousness among people about the climate crisis and lead to more people taking action?
I think probably there will be a temporary effect. And, I mean, it's always salutary, of course, to, when we have a wake-up call that we're not talking about climate change that will happen in the future or climate change that will affect our children or our grandchildren. This is a climate crisis that is affecting us now. So, in many ways, yes. I mean, every time that there's a sort of an extreme weather event, it's a wake-up call to an extent. I think, though, I mean, we can't sort of sit back and rely on there being climate crisis events to wake people up, because I think that effect is only temporary. Because after all, we've been having extreme weather events that have actually killed lots of people in the West for quite a long time. I mean, when was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans? That was 2005, I think. Yeah. So that's 16 years ago, and that did see an uptick in people sort of noticing climate change and worrying about climate change. But that in itself is only temporary. I mean, it's important to point out that what things like the heat dome shows is that this idea, which apparently the BBC was still promulgating, 20 years after everyone else has given up on it, that climate change might be quite nice because it will make everywhere a bit warmer, and in Britain we'll have a Mediterranean climate. It's like, it's a useful reminder that is not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is profound climate destabilization, which will not be good for anyone ever. So it's useful to remember that. But I think we can't wait for the weather to do our work for us. We need to build awareness and build the movement, and there aren't sort of shortcuts to do that.
You mentioned the BBC. What role do you think the media have sort of played in downplaying the crisis and sort of subduing it?
I mean, I think historically, possibly, you can argue that yes, there was a period when the media weren't really taking the climate crisis seriously. But in recent years, I mean, there's an awful lot of media does pay an awful lot of attention to it. I mean, if you look at, say, the sort of Guardian's coverage, they do have a lot of coverage on the climate crisis. So it's not about, I think, sort of people who kind of make it into rather a conspiracy theory that, the media companies are in hock to the oil companies and therefore they won't report on it. I don't think that's really true. I think the problem is that real action on climate change involves stepping outside of the neoliberal consensus, and that is something that our media, both the broadcast media, press media, really doesn't want to do. So therefore, you get people talking about climate crisis, but they're much more likely to devolve into the kind of and it's all working class people's fault if they're still driving or if they're eating fast food or something. And it goes to those changes that don't involve any threat to the system, because actually what we need to do is change the system, and you're not going to read that in the Guardian.
Yeah. And just finally, Cop26 obviously is going to take place in Glasgow later in the year. What do you expect to sort of come out of it, if anything useful? And how should we on the left sort of be responding to it?
Oh, well, from the actual sort of, the actual sort of conference of the parties, the actual talks, I mean, nothing. I mean, there will be some hot air, I expect, and some promises of change that won't come to anything. So we really shouldn't go into it with any illusions that anything that the actual governments are going to talk about at the summit is going to make a difference. But what the international summits do give us is a massive opportunity to galvanize the movement, to bring together people who care about climate crisis, have an enormous party on the streets, talk about our politics, reach people who haven't necessarily paid attention to it before. It's a summit for the movement. and that's what's important about it. So we need to take it really seriously. We need to get as many people to Glasgow as we can, and we need to be, supporting this all the activities that are going on. And I think we need to be bringing lots of politics to it, because a lot of what I've seen being planned up until now, sort of, through the wider sort of green movement in this widest possible sense, it's great. It's a lot of things that will bring sort of climate change to people's attention who maybe haven't thought about it before, and it's all quite fun. But it's all quite cuddly. It's all quite, oh yes, we need to do something about climate crisis, but we're not going to say what that something is. And I think our role here is to say, yes, that's all great, that's all important, but we do need to have the serious political conversations. And it's not something that's going to be changed by goodwill and doing a play in the park. Good those things are. So I think that needs to be our role, and we're working on it.
Yeah, we are. Okay, thank you very much for speaking to me.
That's okay.